Well, good morning again. So nice to be with all of you. And don't we have a great band? Yeah. And they have to stand up the whole service. I want to assure you all that we will not be talking about weeping and gnashing of teeth today. I'm sure that's a welcome message for all of you. Yeah, if I started that, John Ross would be whistling me off, and there'd be a shepherd's crook yanking me off the stage. So we're not going to do that today. I don't know about you, but I love Jesus' parables. I love them for a lot of reasons. They're great teaching tools, but mostly I love them because they force us to have some skin in the game. A little over 20 years ago, I was chairing the city's arts, culture, and entertainment initiatives, and one of our very first tasks was to define the difference between arts and entertainment. One afternoon, Norman Magdon, who was the head of the art department over at UT at the time, and I were walking through an art gallery trying to come up with a working definition that would help guide our efforts. And we decided that the difference between art and entertainment is that art requires something of the people experiencing it. Entertainment, you can let it flow right over you. Entertainment is passive. I mean, think of most of the television shows we have on TV today. You don't have to do a thing. You can just sit there and let it go right over you. But art requires something of us. Art requires us to think, to evaluate, to examine ourselves in relation to it. That's the way parables work too. Today's gospel is overflowing with vivid images, mustard seeds and yeast that leavens and hidden treasure and fine pearls and nets overflowing. For some reason, as I was preparing for the day, I found myself drawn to that parable where Jesus likens God's kingdom to yeast that leavens bread. I don't know for sure, but I think it might be because next week I have to start my post-vacation low-carb diet, and I'm afraid I'm going to start thinking about bread a lot over the next few weeks. But I digress. When employing parables, Jesus had a real knack for grabbing his audience's attention, often by turning accepted meanings of a particular image on its head. Professor Amy Jill Levine over at Vanderbilt points out that most metaphorical references to yeast in the Bible compare it to something negative, corrupt, or unholy, such as when Jesus admonishes the disciples to beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So when Jesus compared the kingdom of heaven to yeast, his listeners would have sat up and paid attention. Maybe we need to also. But first, let's begin with a few clarifications that I think will help us understand what Jesus was really trying to convey to his listeners that day. The word yeast in the passage that we just read is the Greek word for that is zuma. And it refers to what we in the South call a sourdough starter. Not the cultured yeast powder that we often think when reading a recipe for making bread. So it's not something that could be sprinkled or mixed into the dough as we normally think. Rather, it was a well-formed, round, semi-solid thing that can be held in one's hand. To be honest, it feels kind of like a combination of Play-Doh and silly putty. Many of you know what I'm talking about because you, like me, grew up in places where sourdough starters were a treasured gift. And when people would share it among neighbors, it was something we were always glad to have. Next, most English translations say that the woman mixed the yeast with the flour, but that's not what the Greek actually says. The Greek word that is usually translated as mix is really encrypto, which comes from the root word that means to hide. Think of our English word encryption. So rather than mixing the yeast with the dough, the earliest Greek translations tell us that the woman actually hid the starter inside the dough, folding the dough around it, forming a womb of sorts in preparation for its kneading. in crypto carries an additional meaning as well. It refers to something that is not only hidden, but one day will be revealed. So the woman in Jesus' parable hides the yeast in the dough so that it can be kneaded and nurtured until its time has come. There's a sense that the dough is pregnant with potential. Next, we read that the woman mixed the yeast with a large amount of flour. In the original Greek, the text says 3 sattas, or measures. Well, Professor Levine estimates that 3 measures equals 40 to 60 pounds of flour, enough to make 60 dozen donuts, or biscuits, if you will. It's an image of extravagant abundance. And Jesus' listeners would have been able to connect the dots. They would have heard a promise that something hidden and wonderful would be revealed in due time. Something that, while it might be impossible to imagine in the present moment, would eventually come to fruition and would be well worth the wait. My dear friend, Sister Elizabeth Riney, she was a friend and mentor to me when I was over at St. Mary's. She used to say on regular occasions, when God's purposes are hidden, we live on in his promises. When God's purposes are hidden, we live on in his promises. In the midst of this crazy world in which we find ourselves, Jesus provides us a reason for hope. He promises that he remains with us. And ultimately, if we can find a way to hold fast to our faith, to love rather than to fear, to embrace that which is new and sometimes uncomfortable, to resist the temptation to retreat back into old patterns, old assumptions, old ways of seeing the world, then God's abundant kingdom awaits. Not only in the world, but more importantly, in our hearts. Amen.